بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يرفع الله الذين آمنوا منكم والذين أوتوا العلم درجات صدق الله العلي العظيم. My dear respected, my most honorable elders, beloved brothers and sisters who may be watching at home, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The topic of today's discussion is the purpose of it is to increase our pride, our dignity within our faith. And this is so important in the day and age that we live in. That we have to feel a sense of pride and not a sense of, embarrassment and shame when it comes to our iman. As Muslims, we feel there's, like the early Muslims, they had to hide their faith. And the reasons why they had to hide their faith was to protect themselves, to protect their lives. We don't have to protect our lives anymore. We just hide our faith to protect, ourselves against excessive questioning. That's it. Or feeling a bit embarrassed or being in an uncomfortable situation. Because I genuinely had this. A person came up to me and he says, Imam Sahib, at my workplace, I've got some people who don't really like Muslims or Islam in general, and they've got a lot to say about Muslims. And he said that when people ask me if I'm a Muslim, I just say, no, I'm a Sikh or I'm a Hindu. Because, Indians who are Sikhs and Hindus look like me. He's from a Pakistani Asian background. And is it permissible for me to do that? And that question kind of shocked me, that a person would go to lengths to hide their iman, and not only hide their iman, to say to people, no, I'm no longer a Muslim, so that people won't constantly, ask them questions and put them in uncomfortable situation. That's something for us to think about. Why is it that our sense of pride, izzah, that Islam gives, it's gone down? It's almost non-existent. We live in a new technological age with constant achievements being made in the fields of mathematics, in the fields of science. The world is progressing at a rapid rate. And unfortunately, when we look at all of these modern, and this is the reason why people are turning away from Islam as the major contributor and inspirational factor in their lives, that many of these modern technological advancements that are being made in their time, they have nothing to do with Islam. So they see Islam as being somewhat backward and intolerant. Because they look in the field of technology and say, look, non-Muslims are making all the advancements. The field of science, the field of medicine, all these different types of fields. And they don't realize how Islam has contributed to the modern day and the modern age that we live in today. Hence, when we see somebody who is a Muslim, who's achieved something in a particular field and is being recognized for it, we feel a sense of pride because we feel that connection with that person. And we think, oh, subhanAllah, a Muslim has achieved something. We don't realize that in our storied history of 1400 years, we've got Muslims who have achieved magnificent things. And the world is where it is today because of the contributions and the achievements by Muslim scholars of the past. And this is what dents, because the most notable Muslim breakthroughs have been in the past and there is none that they have seen today or experienced today, it dents the pride of the Muslims in themselves, in their rich culture, their rich tradition and heritage. They become extremely misinformed. Let me tell you, I'll give you an example. Do you know a person called Sam Harris? Some people who might be watching online might know Sam Harris. He's a popular, infamous critic of Islam. And, one thing is criticizing Islam with knowledge. One thing is just aggressively trying to alienate people and trying to sow the seeds of fitna and discourse. That's who he is, Sam Harris. And in one of the articles, when Malala Yousafzai, when she was given a Nobel Peace Prize, he wrote that that, and you know who Malala Yousafzai is, you know, the education activist. He said that she is the best thing to come out of the Muslim world for the last 1,000 years. Never has a more ridiculous statement been made. That Malala Yousafzai is the best thing that came out of the Muslim world for the last 1,000 years. Hidden in this comment is the idea and the notion that Malala's fellow Muslims are backwards, they're intolerant, and that her religion, Islam, is not conducive, does not inspire change, or does not inspire progress. It's absolutely ludicrous. And it clearly shows his lack of understanding of Islam and our rich history. And our history and our heritage is hidden. This is the truth. People don't want to talk about it. Nowadays, Muslims' contributions to the world are hidden. Whenever we have lessons in history in our schools, and we talk about the Dark Ages. It was the Dark Ages in Europe, but Islam had lit up the world in the East. The Noor of Islam came here and inspired the revolution and inspired the people to make change. The industrial, every type of revolution, whether there was a political revolution, industrial revolution, was supported by the Muslims. Conveniently, you want to hide that. We talk about Islam in India. We talk about the history of India and the history of the British Raj and the British rule, and then prior to that, the Hindu Raj. Why do we never mention the storied Muslim history of India? We see what's happening in India today with Muslims. Unfortunately, I was just reading it online today, in I think it was Ahmadabad. The attacks on Muslim owned businesses, and there's riots going on there. Why is it that Muslims are not told about their history? Muslims ruled India, and it was a beautiful land. It was the most richest land in the world. The most wealth belonged to India. Why don't we talk about that? Why is that conveniently hidden from the people? Conversely to all of these critics and these false notions of people like Sam Harris, Muslims have made enormous contributions to civilization. And the reason for that is because of Islam's emphasis that we place on ilm and the seeking of knowledge. Because of our emphasis on knowledge, that's why so much was produced. Even now in today, up until 50 years ago, these countries in the West had the lowest rates of literacy in the world. Muslims always had the highest rates of literacy. Muslims, under Khilafah, every Muslim knew how to read or write. It was unacceptable that a Muslim did not know how to read or write. Up until 50 years ago in this country, half of the population did not know how to read or write. Half of the population. Every single Muslim, 100, 3, 4, 5, 600 years ago, and up until 50 years ago, half of the population did not know how to read or write. So I'm going to hope to dispel some of the stereotypes and misconceptions that are exacerbated by people like Sam Harris and other anti-Islam activists by highlighting some of those contributions. When we talk about, when Sam Harris said Malala Yousafzai, and I'm just going to mention a few of them because we're going to have to do 2 separate videos for this and 2 separate talks because there's so many that I want to go through. Just the major ones. And it's impossible to cover every single field. Malala's quest for universal education, for which she was given a Nobel Peace Prize, and Sam Harris called her the best thing to come out of the Muslim world for 1,000 years. Her quest is based and it follows in Muslims' long and proud history in the field of education. I'll tell you how important this is, and for people to know this. Most non-Muslims don't know this, and we as Muslims don't know in order for us to tell them. Is that right? We don't, do we? The first 2 universities in the world, not just the Islamic world, in the world, were created by two women, or were inspired by two women. The first is Sayyidah Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha. We'll ask, how did Sayyidah Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha, how did she inspire the first, among the first universities?
The university in Morocco.
That's a different one. That's Maryam and Fatima al-Firhi, right? Who, and I'm going to get to that. The first is Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha, the companion, the daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How did she inspire? What is Al-Azhar named after, Sheikh Mahmoud? Al-Azhar is named after, the reason why it's called Al-Azhar is due to Sayyidah Fatima al-Zahra. Because of Sayyidah Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha. Right? Absolutely. So that's the inspiration there. The second university ever in the Islamic world, second oldest is Al-Azhar. The first oldest university in the Islamic world, not only in the Islamic world, in all the world, is the and this is according to UNESCO, the Guinness World Records, is the Qarawiyyin in Fez in Morocco. And that was first built in 859 AD. 859 AD. A mere less than 160 years after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, less than 200 years after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, the first university was constructed. And shortly after that, a short while later, Al-Azhar, which I had the honor of attending and being a part of, was established in 972 AD.
Didn't last until now.
Yeah, Qarawiyyin is closed now. Yeah. Azhar is an institution that, of course, still exists. It was built during the Caliphate of Al-Mu'izz, and Fatima al-Firhi, Maryam al-Firhi, two sisters. She was a woman. She was a Muslim woman. She is the one who inspired the construction of the Qarawiyyin in Fez in Morocco. Muslim women were establishing centers of learning in the 9th century, 1100, 1200 years ago. For many years, they were schooled in a plethora of secular and religious subjects. And at the end of their educations, teachers evaluated the students, provided them with certificates, and they were given degrees. This is why it's recognized as a university. That was happening 1100 years ago in the Muslim world. The concept of awarding degrees would spread from Fez in Morocco to Andalusia in Spain, and then later to the universities of Bologna in Italy, and then here to the universities of Oxford and Cambridge that we pride ourselves on so much. Where did it come from? Islam, Muslims. This is so important that we highlight this. We highlight the contributions that we have made. Up till 100 years ago here, Muslim women did not even have the right to vote. You saw the suffragette movement you studied perhaps when you were in school. Women did not have the right to attend universities. Attend universities, to study. Sorry, women, not just Muslim women, women here in the UK. In America, 100 years ago, were women attending? No. Women did not have the right to attend universities to study in the West up until about 80 or 90 years ago. 1100 years ago, Muslim women were establishing centers of learning. This is the difference. This is why we have to have pride in who we are and where we've come from. And this is why knowledge of that particular history of ours, it helps to, dispel some of the, the doubts that we may have. Spanish Muslims of Andalusia in Spain were especially strong advocates of education, and this is why it spread here throughout Western Europe. And they helped to dispel the gloom that had enveloped Europe in the Dark Ages. Between the 8th and the 15th centuries, Andalusia was the epicenter. It was a center for education and knowledge throughout the world. Spanish universities in Cordoba, in Granada and Seville had Christian and Jewish students alongside Muslim students studying in them. Women were encouraged to study in Spain between the 8th and the 15th centuries. We're talking about a time when, in Britain, we call it the Dark Ages. We don't even want to talk about that history. It was non-existent. And in Muslims, the world was thriving. This is the educational environment that, that stressed so much tolerance, and it existed in Islam. And it didn't even reach the Western world up until the 20th and 21st century. Then you got contributions in philosophy, right? One of the greatest Muslim contributions to civilization began in the 8th century when Muslim scholars, they inherited the works of Greek philosophy, the wisdom of the ancient Greek texts. The only reason why we know of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates today here in the UK, in the Western world that we live in the English language, the works are translated. Do you think they were translated from ancient Greek into English? They were translated by Muslims into Arabic, and from Arabic they were translated and brought here to the Western world. This is how ancient Greek was taught. It was revitalized in the Muslim world. Those texts were lost to the Europeans. It was translated from Latin to Arabic by Muslim scholars, and thereby creating that greatest transmission of knowledge in world history. It was Muslim scholars who would eventually bring all the ideas of Greek minds, such as the ones that I mentioned, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, to Europe. And it was their philosophy was then translated into European languages. So now, when we all study, what's the main language in the world? English, right? It's like the default language. In order for you to study something, all the books, all the main everything is always in the English language, right? Primary things. Whereas in the past, it was Arabic. People in Europe who wanted to study and who had a desire to study, they would go to the Arab world. They would learn Arabic, and then they would translate books from Arabic into English. This is why the Muslims are the main reason behind the Enlightenment, the area of the Age of Enlightenment and the European Renaissance that occurred in the 16th and 17th centuries here in Western Europe, and gave new life to the European continent. It was Muslim scholars, the most notable of them, Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, a Sufi Muslim who in the 11th and the 12th centuries, he revolutionized early Islamic philosophy by developing something called Neoplatism, which is often described as sort of the mystical and religious interpretation of Greek philosophy. At the time of Al-Ghazali's writing, Muslim philosophers had only read about the ideas of ancient Greece. But these ideas were seen as, they were rejected by early scholars. As they don't conform with Muslim teachings and Muslim values, so we're going to reject them. Ghazali was the first one to try to conform some of those teachings with Islam and adopting some of those techniques as Muslims. Ibn Khaldun is another one of the most important Muslim thinkers in history. He's recognized as one of the greatest historians and the founder of the sociological sciences in the 14th and 15th centuries. And he created the earliest one of the earliest non-religious philosophies in history in his work, the Al-Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun. And he paved way for all expectations of the modern day prime ministers and presidents. We see what's going on in Pakistan recently with the ousting of Imran Khan, and we talk about politics and how politics is such a ridiculous and dirty game in the Muslim world, right? It was Ibn Khaldun. He created the first framework for good leaders, which was adopted by the democratic system that exists today. This is what he said, Ibn Khaldun, in the 14th century. He said, the sovereign, the leader, he exists for the good of the people. So as in a government for the people, by the people, what democracy essentially is. The necessity of a ruler arises from the fact that human beings have to live together. And unless there is someone to maintain order, society would break to pieces. Throughout the golden era, Arabic became the language of science. Arabic became the language of advancement. Arabic became the language of technology, of progression. Maimonides, have you heard of the scholar, the Jewish scholar Maimonides? He's a student of the famous Andalusian Ibn Rushd, who wrote, and Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina were two great historians, two great philosophers in the Muslim world, experts in the field of science and medicine. And what are they called here see, you know, we make everything sort of non-religious. You know, I was reading in a book once, and this is before this is a very, very long time ago when I was very young, and it said, you know, Avicenna said this, and Averroes, Avicenna and Averroes, and they were talking about these two individuals, Avicenna and Averroes. Who's Avicenna? Who's Averroes? Avicenna is Ibn Sina. Averroes is Ibn Rushd. You know, give them, Latinize their names, you know, talking about the fact they're looking at their contributions, but never once mentioning that these were Muslims, and it was Islam that inspired them to make the contributions that they did. They're the ones, Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, they revived the works of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, and Arabic was the language of the civilized world at the time that they translated them into. In mathematics, I'm going to leave it at this, and then we'll end here because there's so much more. In mathematics, the numbers that we use today, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then the letter 0 are all Arabic numbers. They were learned and taken or from Indians. Muslim mathematicians brought our numerical system here to Europe in the 12th century, and it revolutionized the study of mathematics and science. 0 was created by the Indian Muslims. This replaced the new Roman numerical system that existed here. The use of cipher, which is 0, it was devised in India some centuries earlier. And even the very word 0 is taken from what word? What's the word for 0 in Arabic? Sif. 0 is taken from the word sif. You studied maths in school, right? I studied maths in school. I hated it, right? What was the worst part of maths? Algebra, right?
Algebra.
Yeah? Algebra. You know, we've made that British too. Latinized that name as well. Algebra is the subject we all hated studying in school. And for that, we have to thank a Muslim mathematician, Muhammad Abu Musa al-Khwarizmi, in 780 to 850 AD. So this is less than 200 to 300 years after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His book, which was titled Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, it was translated later in the 12th century into Latin, and it was the most and it was the most important mathematical text in Europe for the next 400 years. Al-Jabr is algebra. You know what do we use for computers? Every device requires an algorithm. This is again taken from Islam. Absolutely. So all of these fields, we haven't even spoken about. I haven't even got to healthcare, which is Sheikh Mahmoud Alaa's field, and medicine, and more specifically in relation to surgery, general surgery. The tools, the scalpel created by Muslims, the tools that we still use for surgery today were created by Muslims. Forget about the tools, the entire subject is dedicated to Muslims. So inshallah, the likes of Ahmad ibn Tulun Hospital in Egypt, we're going to talk about that, and there's many others. Ibn Tulun was actually, subhanAllah, it was built in 872 in Cairo, and it was the first hospital over 1200 years ago. It was the first hospital. You know what? it would treat the mentally ill. Forget the physically ill, mentally ill. We understood depression 1100 years ago as Muslims. We don't understand it now. As Muslims, we treated depression 1100 years ago, in the Ahmad ibn Tulun hospital. So there's so many, and these are supposed to give us, they're supposed to build pride, izzah in our hearts for Islam, from our religion. At the same time, it's supposed to bring about a tinge of sadness. Is it not? Like, this is how great we once were. Why can't we be like that again? There's nothing stopping us. There's nothing stopping us.
Lack of study knowledge. As a youth, we don't read history. That's why we hide our history. But we have to study.
We Muslims don't know our history, and non-Muslims hide our history. That's the way it works. We don't know our history. We can only really, truly be able to make those advancements and be like that again if we know our history. We don't know it, and we don't teach it to our children. Our children know about the First World War and the Second World War because they get taught it in school. How often are they taught about Badr and Uhud and Khandaq? Never. How often are they taught about Muslim expansion in the world? At one time, the Muslims made up 1/3 of the world's population. That's a magnificent amount. Why is that not part of our historical records and subjects? The only time we will talk ever about anything got to do with Islam was probably the Ottoman Empire, and even then we want to hide that. We don't want to recognize the Ottoman Empire as somewhat good. The Ottoman Empire helped Western Europe, even to date. It was the Ottoman Turks who helped end famine in Ireland. When Europe was unable to help them. It was Ottomans who helped France, Ottomans who helped Spain. Who were those Ottomans? They were Muslims. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq and the ability. Inshallah, tomorrow we'll continue and I'll mention more about them. I definitely want to talk about Arazi of Persia, who's called Razes in the Western world. He's the Ibn Sina, the principal of physicians. I want to discuss some things in relation to him as well. Inshallah, we'll talk about their work tomorrow. Allahumma anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa 'allimna ma yanfa'una wa zidna 'ilma walhamdulillahi ala kulli hal. Ameen.